The late-night flight from Seattle to New York was dead quiet when Grace Holloway, a 28-year-old CEO completely exhausted, accidentally passed out on the shoulder of a stranger. Nobody on that plane had a clue this man was a single dad working 2 jobs just to cover his 6-year-old daughter's upcoming heart surgery. When the airplane suddenly hit violent turbulence, Grace jolted awake terrified, then froze when she realized his jacket was gently draped across her shoulders. His bruised arm was locked against the seat rail, having held her safe for an hour while she slept. But what made Grace completely break down after that flight was something so much bigger, and you and I wouldn't have seen it coming. Heavy rain was pouring over Seattle-Tacoma International Airport on a bitter Thursday night late in October. It lashed against the terminal glass, turning the black tarmac into a blur of runway lights. Grace Holloway stood quietly at Gate B-17, a carry-on bag over her shoulder and a hollow, totally numb expression on her face, a look her assistant had quietly learned to call the absolute shutdown mode. The exact look she got whenever she had been awake way too long, with absolutely nothing left to give. At 28, she was the youngest CEO in the 40-year history of Holloway Dynamics, wearing a perfectly tailored black blazer over a crisp white blouse that somehow looked flawless, even after 72 brutal hours without real sleep. The Seattle deal had completely collapsed. 3 grueling days of negotiations, 2 entirely sleepless nights in a hotel suite, and 1 final morning where the opposing lawyers walked out in pure silence. Every bit of it meant absolutely nothing. Furious shareholders were already sending her messages. The board demanded answers by Monday, and the tabloids just published a brutal story on Holloway Dynamics tanking quarterly profits right under the headline, "Is the Ice Queen finally melting?" She hadn't told a single soul. Her dad had been gone for 6 months, and the only reason she fought so incredibly hard for this Seattle acquisition was because it was his original dream. Meanwhile, let's look at the back of the boarding line. A man in a worn navy jacket quietly stepped aside, letting an elderly woman pass. He didn't announce it or expect any thanks, he just calmly stepped away, gave a gentle smile when she patted his arm, then went right back to staring at his screen. Caleb Ryan was 32 years old. Built strong, like a guy who spent years doing heavy physical labor without really thinking about it. Having the kind of rough, calloused hands that tell a story better than any fancy resume. His backpack was battered but neatly packed and safely tucked into the front zipper was a tiny prescription pill bottle. The pharmacy label quietly read, "Lily Ryan, age 6. He was a hard-working, certified systems maintenance technician who just spent the last 3 exhausting days in Seattle for a recertification course, and every single day he called home exactly twice. Once every morning and once at night, just to check on his little girl, who was staying with their neighbor Mrs. Alvarez while he was gone. Their video call that evening was short but incredibly sweet, ending with Lily pressing her tiny face up to the camera and whispering with total seriousness, "Don't forget the moon cookies, Daddy." He actually wrote it down on the back of his boarding pass so he absolutely wouldn't forget. You and I know fate works in mysterious ways. Grace got seat 14A and Caleb got 14B. She sized him up immediately, the exact way she judged any stranger she couldn't use briefly. She filed him away as completely irrelevant just 4 seconds after sitting down. Opening her laptop, she attacked a corporate report she had been battling since Tuesday. She tried her absolute hardest to treat the quiet man beside her like invisible furniture. Caleb just settled in, turning on an audio show about electrical engineering. He rested his tired head back, offering her nothing but absolute silence. The late-night flight took off 40 minutes behind schedule into a storm. Shortly after takeoff, the main cabin lights faded into total darkness. The shaking started fast. Above them, the captain's voice calmly promised that the severe turbulence was just a little bad weather passing through. Things would settle down soon. Grace just kept typing away. That blue computer screen glowed as the only source of light in their row, her tired fingers flying rapidly across the keys with the cold efficiency of someone who simply refuses to feel her own exhaustion. But somewhere high above Idaho, her worn-out body finally surrendered completely. Her heavy eyelids fell shut completely against her will. Her tense muscles gave out, and quietly the powerful executive Grace Holloway slipped away. This fierce woman, known as the most terrifying young leader in the tech industry, collapsed fast asleep onto a total stranger's shoulder. Caleb felt her heavy weight drop onto his arm and he looked over. Seeing the deep stress lines still etched across her sleeping face, he chose quiet kindness. He did not wake her. He shifted slightly to keep her secure. Reaching up with his free arm, he grabbed his coat from the hook above. And he laid it over her with the tender, practiced care of a father who had spent 6 long years tucking in his girl. Walking down the aisle, a flight attendant noticed the sweet moment and smiled at him. "Your wife is really out," she whispered. Caleb offered a sad, gentle smile. "She must be completely exhausted," he replied. 40 minutes later, the violent shaking returned, much worse this time. The seatbelt light flashed with a loud ding as the whole airplane violently shook. The sudden drop sent frightened passengers desperately grabbing hold of their armrests. Grace slept right through it. She was lost somewhere incredibly deep and unreachable. You and I know that crash, when you burn on stress for days until your broken body simply overrides every alarm. Fighting the drops, Caleb gripped the seat ahead with one hand, wrapping his other arm firm to block the sleeping woman from spilling into the aisle. He anchored her safely against the violent tossing of the aircraft. The hard plastic armrest smashed into his arm twice. It hit his forearm hard before he found a safer angle. And when the rough flight finally smoothed out 20 long minutes later, a dark bruise was already blossoming near his elbow, a hidden ache he would carry for 3 days. He refused to move her. He chose to shield her, quietly absorbing the pain himself. Across the aisle, an angry businessman had been staring at them with pure annoyance since the terrible shaking began. "Hey buddy," the man scoffed, his voice loud enough to carry. "Just shove her off. That is completely not your problem." Caleb met the angry stare for a moment, completely blank. "She is fine where she is," he whispered, turning back to the dark window. The stranger grumbled a bitter insult and went right back to his drink. You see, Caleb just watched the moonlit clouds, quietly carrying his own heartbreak over Lily. He carried the memory of her sudden laugh, a short startled sound, just like a tiny hiccup. He remembered how small and pale she looked leaving the hospital that last time, wrapped up in her little yellow coat, asking him with total seriousness if they could go get ice cream, even in the pouring rain. His ex-wife, Dana, walked away 14 months ago. She called from some random parking lot, her voice entirely hollow, to say she was never coming back. Her goodbye was cold, clinical, almost like a business transaction. "I'm not equipped for this life." She treated their daughter's failing heart like a liability she could just cancel. Instead of a little girl, she was abandoning completely. Caleb never fired back with cruel words. After hanging up, he just sank right onto the kitchen floor. He pressed his back against the cabinets and sat there for hours. Then he stood up, cooked dinner, and started hunting down pediatric heart specialists. Let's step back onto that quiet plane. Beside him, Grace shifted softly in her sleep, her fingers blindly brushing his heavy sleeve. She gripped the fabric tightly, just like a tired kid clutching a security blanket. He stared at her resting hand, then turned his gaze back to the pitch-black window. Caleb didn't see the ruthless executive from the magazines. He saw a woman completely drained, carrying an absolute bone-deep exhaustion. The kind of total fatigue that settles in when you shoulder a massive burden all by yourself for years. He knew that look well. He stared at that exact same sadness in his own bathroom mirror every single morning. As the cabin lights flicked on and people started grabbing their carry-on bags overhead, Grace woke up groggy, blinking through that dizzy haze of sleeping somewhere totally strange. Then she completely froze, snapping awake to exactly where her heavy head had been resting all night long. She yanked herself away instantly, an apology already spilling out, "I am so sorry." I don't know how, and then she just froze. She was staring right at his arm. A fresh, angry purple bruise stretched all the way down from his elbow to his wrist. "You and I know what this means." She instantly realized the silent, painful price he paid. Her jaw hung open, but the words completely failed her. For the first time in forever, the usually sharp Grace Holloway had absolutely zero words left to say. "Why didn't you wake me up?" she eventually managed to ask. Instinct made her voice sound totally flat. It was her classic shield, the cold tone she used whenever an emotional hit landed too close to home. Caleb quietly pulled his jacket sleeve over the swollen bruise without even blinking. Then he gave a gentle shrug, like they were casually chatting about the morning rain. "You were finally asleep," he calmly replied. Seemed like it had been a while. Grace just stared at him. That gentle answer broke every rule she knew about how strangers act on airplanes. His pure, simple kindness knocked her off balance, like bracing for a harsh step in the dark only to find soft, solid ground instead. She still had no clue why his quiet grace shook her completely. But that profound feeling shadowed her right off the runway. How Grace built her tough corporate armor by 28 wasn't a complex origin story, but it was incredibly brutal. Her strict father, Richard Holloway, was the type who only showed affection by piling on more intense work responsibilities. Let's be honest, she grew up believing love meant hitting impossible goals, not quiet kindness. 6 months after his death, she hadn't taken a single day off to mourn. Partly because Holloway Dynamics was mid-merger and duty demanded her presence. You and I know the feeling. She hadn't yet found a quiet place for her grief. The board originally voted against her taking the CEO role. They cited her youth and inexperience. For 4 brutal months, they watched her every move, praying she would crack so they could force her out. Then there was Marcus, an ex-boyfriend and senior partner at a rival firm. He spent 8 long months manipulating her trust to steal proprietary deal data. After draining that intelligence, he dumped her via text and joined a direct competitor. The business media ruthlessly crowned her the Ice Queen of Holloway Tower shortly after. She chose to quietly carry that pain, wearing the title like impenetrable armor. Cut to the bustling JFK terminal. A gentle stranger named Caleb reached up unprompted, freeing her luggage from where it had gotten stubbornly jammed at an awkward angle in the bin. The broken suitcase wheel had snagged fiercely on the compartment lip. He placed it before her and kindly stepped back, when Grace grabbed her wallet by reflex. Her cold, automatic response whenever someone provided any kind of service. He simply raised his hand, offering a brief, gentle shake of his head. "No need," he said softly. "You and I know that look." She froze, totally unsure how to handle a man who seemingly wanted absolutely nothing in return for his quiet kindness. She was still processing that moment out. Then his phone buzzed and he stepped away to take a video call. She should have just walked toward the exit where her driver waited. Instead, she stayed rooted beside her bag. Through the terminal chaos, a small, hopeful voice pierced right through to her. "Daddy, my heart didn't hurt as much today. The doctor said that's a good sign." Then, barely pausing for breath, "Did you get the moon cookies?" Caleb's tired shoulders shifted, revealing a man quietly choosing to smile despite everything. "First thing tomorrow, bug," he whispered. Grace grabbed her bag and marched toward the exit without turning back, mostly because she could feel her armor quietly cracking open, exposing a pain she wasn't quite ready to face. She remembered his quiet strength for 3 days before acting, convincing herself it was just some ruthless professional instinct kicking in. An annoying data gap she needed filled, a mysterious variable she couldn't control. By day 4, she ordered her assistant Marcus to dig into his background. Marcus spent the better part of a morning on it, returning to her office looking visibly stunned. Caleb Ryan, 32, certified electrical systems technician, working for a small subcontracted maintenance firm. 0 criminal record, 0 major debt, just a tiny student loan he almost finished paying. No social media footprint whatsoever and absolutely no red flags on his permanent record. He is as completely off the grid as a normal human gets, Marcus explained, but buried much deeper in his professional history was a heartbreaking burden that stopped Grace cold when Marcus read it. 7 years prior, Caleb Ryan was the lead systems engineer at Meridian Corp, a mid-sized infrastructure startup where he spent 14 long months, quietly designing a brilliant proprietary network routing architecture that they had. We've all seen Cruelty. They patented and sold it for $11 million, erasing Caleb entirely while he silently endured. He tried fighting it in court. It led absolutely nowhere. Then, 3 months later, his little girl received her diagnosis. Grace read his background file 3 entire times. A photo was attached to a hospital intake record from a year prior, just a small corner detail pulled from public files. In that grainy picture, Caleb sat in a cheap plastic waiting room. He held little Lily's hand, smiling at her with the very specific look of a father who decided his own terror simply wasn't allowed to show. Grace stared at that picture for a long time, sitting right in the center of her glass-walled corporate office under cool lights with the soft, steady rhythm of a massively profitable company around her, feeling for the first time in far longer than she could easily measure the distinct, quiet ache of truly recognizing something in someone else that you and I usually refuse to see in ourselves. Tears had been falling for almost a full minute before she finally realized. Caleb, of course, had no idea. He was simply standing on a cold Brooklyn rooftop on a regular Friday afternoon, 40 feet up a maintenance ladder in the biting wind, quietly replacing a busted transformer for a building freezing for 2 straight days. His mind was on Lily's pediatric physical therapy session coming up next Tuesday. He thought about his second shift delivery route, starting right at 7. About the brutal, unforgiving math of this month's rent. Her medicine, the heavy copay his insurance rejected. The $112 he quietly shifted from car repairs to her surgical fund. Their tiny apartment was 540 square feet, every reachable wall plastered in her artwork. A growing gallery of crayon suns, little dogs, and happy houses with smoke floating up from chimneys. You and I know he hadn't forgotten that exhausted woman from the late flight. He just told himself that unconvincing lie every single day since they landed. Exactly 1 week after their flight. A massive fault inside Holloway Dynamics' primary server network triggered a sudden partial IT blackout across 3 entire floors of their Manhattan high-rise. Their internal tech team found the symptom quickly, a corrupted distribution node, but they were completely blind to the root cause. Meanwhile, the IT director, a stressed red-faced guy named Garrett, a man who had survived 11 years at the company, was loudly warning absolutely everyone nearby that they were staring down a massive potential data loss disaster if the network wasn't fully stabilized within 90 short minutes. Grace stepped onto the chaotic floor, pausing right in the server room doorway, listening quietly to Garrett's panicked updates when she suddenly noticed a quiet man on the far side of the noisy room, calmly crouched by an open floor panel holding a diagnostic scanner. Caleb hadn't noticed her yet. He was entirely focused. The company had pulled him in through a subcontractor agency for extra support. A desperate afterthought someone in facilities approved when their own highly paid team panicked. And he had only been on the floor for 22 minutes. In those 22 minutes, he asked for the network map, studied it exactly once, and fell completely silent. Garrett had rudely told him, with that arrogant tone of a man who takes quiet, unexpected competence as a direct personal insult, that the main engineering team had completely ruled out those distribution nodes. Caleb just nodded politely and calmly checked the distribution nodes anyway. He found the true fault in 11 minutes. Stick with me here. It wasn't the flagged node. That was just a symptom, not the source. The real failure hid in a misconfigured relay, a secondary junction installed 6 weeks back during a standard upgrade. It just sat dormant, waiting for the perfect load conditions to start cascading. Left alone for 40 minutes. It would have completely wiped out the primary backup array, too. The room fell dead silent when Caleb stood and explained this in the flat, efficient tone of a man who spoke complex systems as his very first language. Garrett opened his mouth to argue, but a junior tech pulled the schematic on his tablet, stared for 5 seconds, and quietly muttered, "He is right." Grace quietly watched from the doorway as Caleb worked. No wasted motion, nothing theatrical. He lacked the arrogant posturing she constantly saw from people merely pretending to be competent. The moment the crisis passed, she watched 2 senior staffers immediately jump in, trying to position themselves as the heroes who solved it. She saw Caleb step back without a word, letting them take credit, his mind elsewhere. Then she noticed him reach down for his faded backpack. Through the open zipper, she spotted the corner of a paper bakery bag with string handles. His daughter's sweet voice echoed in her memory. First thing tomorrow. His little bug, she knew he had not forgotten. The ache in her chest felt different now, less like sharp grief, more like pure recognition. You know that feeling? Finally putting a name to a heavy burden you have carried blindly. She lingered in the doorway, a moment longer, feeling something deep inside her finally shift after years of staying rigidly closed. Almost invisible, not cracking, not fully collapsing, just quietly beginning to move again. Then she walked across the server room and called him. He turned around, and the tired look crossing his gentle face was nothing like she expected. It wasn't the fake rapid adjustment she usually saw from employees who realized she was boss. It was much simpler. Genuine recognition, maybe a flicker of warmth, then a very careful retreat right back into neutral. That afternoon, she offered him a 3-month consulting contract. A temporary systems advisor answering directly to her, fantastic pay. Totally flexible hours, making clear room for his little girl's medical care. She thought the offer through. She framed it entirely as a professional business deal with clear limits, not pity. He stood outside the server room, listening with a heavy backpack slung over one shoulder. Then, carrying his invisible pain, he answered without any hesitation. No, thank you. She paused, expecting a counteroffer, some hesitation or a polite excuse. There wasn't one, he meant it entirely. He calmly explained without apologizing that he could not accept work pulling him away from Lily, and that years ago he chose to protect his peace and avoid places where people were treated like cold resources to manage, rather than human beings to respect. His tone wasn't bitter, angry, or trying to prove a point. He just stated a firm boundary born from hard experience that he kindly but strictly enforced. So what do we make of Grace? 6 years surrounded by people wanting pieces of her. She stood in that corporate hallway, absorbing something totally new. A man who quietly declined everything this wealthy CEO had to offer. 2 days later, she showed up at his door, a choice she hadn't completely thought through. But the single dad didn't open the door, little Lily did. Wearing striped pajamas at 2 in the afternoon, the girl gave Grace an intensely honest stare. That totally unguarded look only 6-year-olds and wild predators can fully pull off. You're the lady from the airplane, Lily said. Grace just blinked. Your dad told you about me. Lily shook her head and simply stepped aside to let her in. I saw your picture on TV, the little girl said. Step inside with her. This apartment was small, real, and warmer than any expensive corporate suite. The comforting smell of dinner cooking. Lily's drawings covered every single surface. Stacked library books on the coffee table, each holding its own colorful crayon bookmark. Beside the kitchen counter, the door frame held Lily's height marks in pencil. Years of tiny lines with dates carefully written beneath them. The careful record of a kind father who truly paid attention. Grace stood right in the center, struck by a strange and very quiet intensity. Realizing this hurting but kind man had a life so much fuller than hers. Lily pulled Grace over to a small corner table where a drawing was carefully laid out. It showed a tall figure wearing a bright blue jacket. Standing on a plane, arms stretched out to protect a sleeping figure with wings. Lily pointed right at the sleeping figure. That's you, she said. Dad said you were tired. Grace stared at that drawing for a very long time. He was right, she finally whispered almost to herself. She came back the following Thursday, and then the one after that. It started out as something she told herself was just professional networking. But she only believed that lie for about 2 visits before she stopped pretending completely. What was really happening was much simpler and a whole lot scarier. She kept showing up simply because she wanted to. Because Lily would slide extra crayons across the table without even having to be asked. Because this kind home was the one place the exhausted CEO wasn't constantly pressured to make another big decision. Then one cozy Saturday evening, the 3 of them ate pizza on the floor because Lily declared the coffee table entirely too boring. Grace sat cross-legged on a floor cushion and completely ignored her smartphone for 2 straight hours. The longest unplugged stretch of peace she'd found since her father's funeral. She happily helped Lily color in a dragon that was also, for reasons Lily considered completely obvious, a beautiful princess. Caleb leaned against the couch with a slice of pizza, murmuring something easy and low. A joke about the dragon's colors that made Grace laugh, like genuinely laugh. The deep kind of laughter that catches in your chest before it escapes. A joy she hadn't felt in so long, it startled her like a sudden noise in a dead silent room. Later that night, while Lily slept, he told her about his ex-wife, Dana. He shared his hidden pain plainly, without any self-pity, the way he handled absolutely everything. Look at this closely. He chose kindness over hate, and Grace believed him a real revelation. She had cataloged her own anger for years. She never realized the strongest people quietly carry pain while choosing kindness, simply setting the bitterness down to walk forward. He opened up about the night Lily was first admitted, about the specific, haunting look of a hospital. Picture that 2 a.m. corridor with me, where your racing mind exhausts every single option, leaving you with absolutely nothing to do except sit frozen in a plastic chair. And Grace felt her own chest tighten with a painful familiarity that had nothing to do with simple sympathy and everything to do with carrying her own silent grief, sitting alone outside a different room the night her father's monitors finally flatlined. She revealed painful truths she kept hidden from everyone else, including the betrayal by Marcus, her ex. Not the assistant, but the crushing, specific humiliation of realizing in hindsight how deeply she trusted a bond that was entirely transactional. She admitted she swallowed her tears at her father's funeral because she had a board call 2 hours later, an emotional sacrifice she had been quietly paying the price for ever since. She confessed her deep fear that the hardened, resilient version of herself she forged just to survive was now the only piece left. Caleb listened with the gentle, unhurried focus of someone holding deep pain, never once stuffing her quiet moments with hollow comforts she didn't request. Then the power suddenly failed, a common quirk in aging buildings during bitter winter chills. He quietly grabbed a flashlight, located the breaker, and restored everything in 4 minutes. Meanwhile, his daughter woke up and climbed directly, seeking safety, right into Grace's lap in the darkness, showing the pure trust of a child who spots a safe harbor and settles in without hesitation. Lit by candlelight, Lily tilted her head back, asking with the innocent, bold honesty of a kid who hasn't learned to shrink her needs. "Are you going to stay, Coco Grace?" The two guarded adults simply locked eyes across that fragile, flickering flame. Neither of them had an answer. Let's fast forward 12 days to a Tuesday morning. A massive corporate data breach slammed into her company's security systems at 6:43. By 8 o'clock, the brutal scope emerged. Highly sensitive client files were stolen, squeezed down, and quietly leaked over 3 days using stolen employee access. Come 9 a.m., the company's stock plunged 14% right at the opening bell. Grace, burying her panic, reached the headquarters long before the media sharks circled. She anchored the 22nd floor war room alongside her lead security director. Her corporate lawyers, wearing that rigid mask of complete, deliberate calm that everyone present recognized, though nobody actually found it the least bit reassuring. Sebastian Cole himself demanded the emergency board gathering. At 61, he was the 4th oldest member of the corporate board. A rival Grace always suspected of harboring bad intentions, yet she could never firmly prove his deceit until this very moment. Even if the hard evidence wasn't quite secured yet. He commanded the boardroom with the slick, calculated rhythm of a man executing a rehearsed trap, framing the cyber attack as a devastating failure of leadership, gently suggesting, through polite corporate jargon, that they desperately needed to discuss replacing their chief executive officer. 3 allies nodded along, displaying the overly smooth timing of conspirators who absolutely planned this together beforehand. Meanwhile, Caleb was quietly brought back in. Garrett reluctantly asked him to help untangle the messy digital aftermath of the corporate hack. "You and I know true strength is quiet." 6 hours into the grind, he spotted the anomaly. It wasn't buried inside the breach itself, but rather in the digital footprints left behind. Specifically inside the access logs for that single compromised credential. They showed a pattern of logins from a device registered to a user who was supposedly on medical leave during that entire critical window. Someone deliberately used that account, betting the medical absence would hide their tracks perfectly. It was a quiet, precise attack that required deep inside knowledge of the company's entire internal security framework. Caleb quietly brought it to Garrett. Garrett handed it off to Philip, Grace's deputy, a man secretly hired by Sebastian Cole 6 long years ago. Philip buried the file as an inconclusive finding. He never raised the alarm. Grace only learned this because Caleb told her directly. Listen, what happened next was an ambush, not a meeting. Caleb was marched into an 18th floor conference room on Sebastian's orders, forced to defend his supposedly unauthorized access to those sensitive audit records. Sebastian was actually sitting right there, catching Grace completely off guard. He controlled the room with the cold, smooth, measured cruelty of a man who uses contempt as a weapon. He kept calling Caleb the contractor, refusing his name. He clinically tore down Caleb's background, his motives, and his overall judgment. Yet Caleb sat there carrying that quiet strength, refusing to flinch. He answered every single question accurately without giving them an inch more. Grace watched from the doorway. She studied his face, recognizing that same quiet resilience she had seen back on that late-night flight and in his own apartment. A man who understood exactly what was being done to him, silently bearing the weight, deciding his dignity simply could not be taken away. She stepped right to the front of that room. "That is enough," she said, her fierce tone shutting the assault down. "These findings go straight to the security team under my direct oversight." Sebastian's mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing true miscalculation. Grace quietly filed that detail away. "Stick with me here." 2 days later, a vicious story dropped. It claimed the Holloway Dynamics CEO had sparked an inappropriate romance with a lowly contract worker. They cited unnamed board insiders, heavily implying Caleb only got the job because of personal favoritism. The piece was written perfectly, just vague enough to be completely unprovable. Within 24 hours, that damaging lie had spread absolutely everywhere. Grace's legal team sent her strict advice, formally in writing, to immediately cut off all non-professional contact with the named individual. Caleb read that painful story alone at his table at 11 at night. He quietly analyzed how the attack was built, realizing it wasn't meant to destroy Grace's reputation instantly, but to slowly bleed it, hitting her from an angle she couldn't defend without looking worse. He knew exactly what it meant, that her corporate enemies were weaponizing his quiet life against her. Choosing kindness over anger, he texted her 3 short sentences, set the phone down, and went to softly check on his daughter Lily before sleeping. Early the next morning, he told Grace he was stepping away. She instantly argued. She fought back fiercely. She stood outside her office, arms tightly crossed, keeping her voice incredibly low but firm. She swore she would never let him carry this unfair burden, just because throwing him away would be politically convenient for her own survival. Caleb explained, with that gentle kindness he offered everyone, that convenience wasn't the goal. It was always about the impact. The tragic story was already written. Staying close just meant he kept gathering more concrete proof. Plus, 4,200 employees needed that corporate stability, no matter how much pain was secretly breaking him inside. Grace heard his quiet resilience. She hated the unfairness, but she let him walk. That night, reaching out to an old family legal contact, Grace quietly had a corporate lawyer dig up every single file they had on that Meridian Core intellectual property battle from 7 years back. The reality was far uglier than the corporate rumors. Caleb built that entire network architecture over 14 months, proven in his own notes. Time-stamped and proven, but when Meridian Core cashed in on it, an engineering executive named Howard Finch had completely erased Caleb's name from the patent. That same guy grabbed a sweet consulting gig at the buyer's company months later. Caleb fought back with honor, but arbitration ruled for Meridian Core, thanks to a shady panel featuring a former Meridian board member hiding a massive conflict of interest. That brutal timeline, the court loss, his wife walking out, Lily's first hospital stay, all packed into 5 painful months that Grace read 3 times, barely able to stomach it. Have you ever felt the weight of someone's hidden pain? Grace carried it at 1 in the morning, riding home when her phone suddenly flashed an unknown number. Lily was back in the hospital. Grace rushed through those hospital doors 20 minutes later, still wearing her executive suit. She found Caleb lingering outside Lily's door, staring out the window, gripping a cold paper cup of coffee he hadn't even tasted. Even from 15 feet back, she noticed his calloused hands trembling just slightly. He heard her quick footsteps and turned around. For one raw second, she saw his hidden agony, the terror, the utter exhaustion. That crushing burden of being the only kind soul keeping your little girl from darkness. Then he buried the pain deep down because his sick daughter lay 10 feet away. And a selfless man like Caleb never let Lily see fear. Grace moved before her brain caught up, stepping close and wrapping her arms around him. She whispered, "You don't have to carry this heavy burden all alone." He froze. It was the sudden stillness of a gentleman who hadn't been hugged in years, completely unsure if he was finally safe to let go. But he didn't pull away. A second passed and he let his heavy head rest against her shoulder. They just stood there in that silent hospital hallway for a while. Just a selfless single dad and an exhausted CEO way too drained for pretending. 2 weeks passed. Lily stabilized and was scheduled for her major corrective surgery. Grace had, completely behind Caleb's back, secured a top-tier surgical team using her own private wealth manager. She funneled the money through a charity instead of paying the hospital directly. She honestly thought this was a graceful way to protect a strong man's pride. She was totally wrong on both counts. We all know secrets leak. 3 days before surgery, a coordinator accidentally mentioned the foundation account to Caleb. He drove straight to Grace's building, and when she finally opened her door, his fiercely wounded expression told her instantly that she couldn't charm her way out of this. "You and I know," he told her honestly, without cruelty. And Caleb's gentle honesty, carrying heavy hidden struggles, cut precisely to the exact truth you avoid. He showed how she'd stripped away his choices, invading the one private refuge his weary soul had left. For years, this quiet father was treated like his judgment mattered less than other people's ruthless goals. He simply asked her not to add to that silent burden, even with her kind intentions. 4 heavy days passed in absolute silence. Grace sat with that pain, realizing with uncomfortable clarity that this gentleman was completely right. Then, Sebastian launched his ruthless corporate ambush on Wednesday morning. He prepared a fraudulent dossier, polished perfectly like a high-stakes legal brief, formatted perfectly for simultaneous board and press review. It falsely named Caleb as the source of the severe data breach, presenting a slick chain of digital evidence that placed the data exfiltration window exactly when this innocent father accessed the server room. It was highly specific, documented, consistent, and an absolute lie. The fake evidence was built by someone who deeply understood institutional credibility, spending weeks building the scaffolding to destroy a kind man. Sebastian presented his insider threat report with the composed, arrogant confidence of a ruthless man delivering a guilty verdict he personally wrote. Grace sat silently opposite him, carrying her own quiet resolve while enduring his entire presentation. Then she requested a brief 20-minute recess. "You and I know that smug micro-expression of people who think they have already won." But Grace hadn't spent those past 11 days just doing nothing. A former corporate tech contractor for the company named Priya, who had left the enterprise 8 months ago carrying no personal loyalty or reason to protect anyone, had verified a strange network session anomaly she originally witnessed. She hadn't reported it then, simply not understanding the cybercrime she was seeing. Financial forensic experts traced a massive wire transfer routed through a shell company directly to a senior executive at their biggest corporate competitor. A digital security analyst found a hidden second access credential. Not the gentle father's, but one matching the data theft exactly. She already contacted the FBI Cybercrime Division 9 days ago, quietly gathering concrete documentation while agents ran a parallel federal investigation. She walked back into that tense boardroom holding 3 binders and a federal agent. Sebastian Cole was abruptly read his legal rights right inside the corporate boardroom at 10:47 in the morning, facing 12 shocked directors, 4 corporate lawyers and 2 executive assistants, and 1 silently strong CEO. He was escorted from the building, while his panicked defense lawyer was still on hold on his phone. The boardroom fell so dead quiet you could hear the ventilation system humming loudly. Then Grace stood tall, choosing a different path nobody had anticipated. She announced she was stepping down as CEO of Holloway Dynamics. "Stick with me here." Those words sank into the silence like a heavy stone. Her frantic lawyer tried to speak, but she just held up one hand. Choosing quiet strength, she spoke carefully without the cold mask. She delivered the hard news with a quiet, steady strength. For 6 years, work was her only reality. Now you and I can see she almost let it cost her everything that truly mattered. She promised to stay until the transition was complete. She called the company incredibly strong. but it needed a leader whose grief hadn't been hardened into an impenetrable coat of armor. She thanked her late father for leaving behind a legacy truly worth preserving. She never mentioned Caleb's name. She simply didn't have to. Patricia, a board member in her 40s, watched her closely. She had supported Grace from the start, always believing in her. Patricia held her gaze and said, "I hope you find what you're looking for." Grace nodded slowly, packing her things. She walked out looking like someone who had finally set down a massive, invisible weight they had carried for years. On the ride down, somewhere around the 20th floor, she broke down, crying softly all the way to the lobby. 6 weeks later, Lily's surgery was completely flawless. The pediatric cardiologist called it absolutely textbook, and Grace, who never knew surgeons used that term, and had been terrified to even imagine the outcome, instantly knew it was the best news she could hear. Caleb had sat in that waiting room for 4 hours, and when the doctor walked in with that word, he froze completely still for a second, then buried his face in his hands. Not from sadness, but in that profound, "Have you ever felt that?" The total release of a burden finally lifting. Grace just sat close by, choosing the quiet kindness of holding space instead of filling the silence with empty words. 10 days post-surgery, Lily finally came home, looking fragile and exhausted yet entirely herself, fiercely criticizing pillow arrangements, dinner choices, and how awful daytime television shows truly were. She even sketched a detailed diagram of her own healing heart. Recalling the doctor's illustration perfectly, she labeled every single part with bright, cheerful precision. Grace proudly had it framed. 3 weeks later, Grace walked into the apartment and found it completely empty. Not abandoned, rent was paid, and Lily's bright drawings still covered the walls. Library books sat by the door to be returned, but Caleb was entirely gone. Mrs. Alvarez down the hall just said Caleb left a quick message for Grace. He said to meet him over at Reed Street Park, a tiny patch of green beside the children's hospital. It wasn't huge, just a narrow strip of grass wedged between 2 apartment buildings. Usually it was a quiet halfway point for families visiting the nearby pediatric ward. Just a place to catch your breath between difficult moments. But suddenly something had completely changed. We often overlook such quiet kindness, but there, replacing the cracked asphalt and rusted bench, stood a bright, gorgeous playground built with incredible care. Featuring wide ramps and smooth edges, perfectly designed for kids recovering from intense medical procedures. Comfortable benches lined the edge for tired parents to rest. Beside the entrance stood a small painted sign, and Caleb was kneeling quietly by one of the sturdy wooden support posts. He tightened a heavy bolt while Lily sat just 3 feet away, happily bossing him around. She judged him with the total confidence of a tiny project manager. Grace noticed 2 other men building the next section. Just neighbors, she realized. Local folks who pitched in simply because this quiet single dad had asked. You and I can picture her face as she finally realized where the money went. He took every single penny the CEO secretly routed through that medical charity. Every last dollar built this beautiful playground, and not even for Lily. It was for every frightened family sitting helplessly inside that hospital waiting room. Families who just needed a safe place for their sick kids to play normally again. He drew the plans, fought for city permits, and ran the construction for 3 straight weekends. He never kept a single dime to cover his own family's massive medical bills, even though a mountain of unpaid bills was still waiting. Grace froze at the edge of the grass, entirely robbed of her words. Not from trying to stay tough. Every emotional wall she had ever built was totally shattered. She was just absolutely, completely left totally speechless by the unselfish heart of this quiet man. Not just the playground itself, though the gift was truly incredible. Think about what that kind of selfless choice tells us about someone's soul. Choosing pure kindness while carrying a crushing personal burden, in total secret, when no one else was watching or keeping score. Caleb finally glanced up from his tools and spotted her watching him. For a long heartbeat, he stayed completely silent. Then he simply said, with zero need for praise, "There are kids who need it more than we do." His tone was steady, completely humble, and utterly free of ego. Little Lily finally noticed Grace standing quietly on the lawn, and instantly started babbling to anyone who would listen about how The bright new slide was the absolute best, and she had already tested it twice. Grace stepped forward. She still couldn't find the right words, so she didn't even force it. She just dropped into the dirt beside him, their shoulders barely a single breath apart. And then acting entirely on pure unthinking instinct alone, surrendering to the one beautiful truth that suddenly matters more than everything else combined. She gently and deliberately rested her tired head against his shoulder, finally leaning into a sense of deep safety she had spent years desperately trying to outrun. Caleb froze for just a single fragile heartbeat, exactly like he did on that late-night flight when a sleeping stranger first leaned against him. Then he slowly put his wrench down. He wrapped his protective arm around her, pulling her close, catching Lily watching them from the blanket with a very alert, smug, totally satisfied look of a 6-year-old who knew exactly how her family's story should end. Golden afternoon sunlight filtered nicely through the small new saplings planted right along the fence. Down the street, a hospital monitor still beeped its steady rhythm. But here the playground simply echoed with the joyful noise of healing kids and loving parents. And for the very first time, in longer than you or I could possibly imagine, that quiet peace was finally enough. Back on that flight when Caleb first shielded this exhausted woman, she had no idea who he was. Now she understood his hidden strength, and he saw hers. This time he pulled her close, fiercely holding on to the beautiful future they were choosing to build together.